Welcome to our annual ESOP Podcast Summer School series. We selected some of our favorite episodes over the past year to bring you for your enjoyment while we spend the rest of our summer catching our breath. Enjoy.
Welcome to the ESOP Podcast with Bret Keisling, part of the ESOP Podcast Network.
Hello, my friends. Thank you for listening. My name is Bret Keisling, and as it says on my business cards, I'm a passionate advocate for employee ownership. There is one topic in employee ownership that is so very, very important, and I'll be honest with you, I've never really covered it on the podcast. There's somebody in the field, Peter Newman is his name, Peak Wealth Planning is his business. Ironically, I've been on his email list forever. For years, I've been getting email updates and all kinds of things, and I recommend you do that too. So many conversations in employee ownership, both here on the podcast, at conferences, and everywhere, is how do we build wealth? Employee ownership, we know, addresses wage inequality and wealth inequality, but I've never had a podcast on what to do with the money as you reach retirement age. And that's actually where Peter Newman's specialty comes in. That's where his expertise comes in. So you may know Peter from conferences. He's a regular speaker at the NCEO and at the ESOP Association conferences. If you're not registered for his email, I suggest you do that. We'll have some information in our show notes, but it is my pleasure to welcome to the podcast, Peter Newman. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bret. Very happy to be here today and talk about the benefits of employee ownership towards wealth building and retirement.
So it's not just me, Peter. This is kind of almost an overlooked topic. Am I right? Or am I the only one who missed the boat? But it seems to me that we don't put enough focus on, we're building the wealth. We don't put enough focus on how do you handle it when you receive it through your distributions or what have you.
I think, my background growing up in a construction family, a construction household, there wasn't a lot of good financial role models. My parents worked really hard to make ends meet, but we were a little bit boom bust, just the nature of the construction industry. Moved a lot when I was a child. So when I got into college, high school, I thought maybe I should read some financial planning books and learn about this thing called money so I could make some informed decisions. And crossing that over, even as an adult, when I went to college, went to grad school, got my first job working in higher ed, treasury, and investments, I really found that there was a knowledge gap among many of my peers in the professional workplace about how to save, how to build wealth, how to manage your debt load, how to maybe even do a budget, right? Sometimes folks just have money and they have money in their checking account, and they spend it, but they don't really think about beyond today or beyond next week, what's going to happen in 10, 20, 30 years. And sometimes you can't get folks to look out that far if they're in their 20s or 30s. But I specialize in working with people in their 50s and 60s transitioning to retirement. And a lot of those folks are really focused on what's going to happen to me if I stop working, if I switch careers, if I do a second act and start a business. So there's a real need for education in this space so folks can figure out how to handle whether it's an ESOP, a large 401k, an IRA, or maybe even an inheritance, how they turn that wealth into what's really important to them. What's important to them might be a dream, it might be a second home, it might be supporting their family, but they're really trying to translate their dreams and goals into how do I make this a reality? Because whether we like it or not, we live in a society where a lot of the things we do require some financial engine to get those things done. And in terms of my background a little bit, I know you asked me about it before the show, I spent 20 years in higher ed treasury, managing investments, banking, and issuing a lot of debt for stadiums and hospitals and other facilities, doing rating agency presentations. We managed banking. We had 75 different bank accounts where we moved hundreds of millions of dollars a week through to make payments and that kind of thing. And about the time I was 48, I had started my wealth building practice in 2014, was doing it part-time. I had been asked by a family to help them that actually had an ESOP, and I ran the business part-time for about 6-7 years. And then my best friend, who was 48 years old, had become CEO of a very large bank, made his pinnacle in his career, and then unfortunately passed away from a heart attack. And I sat back at 48, 49 years old and said, my best friend of 17 years passed away doing something he loved, but maybe he was not taking care of himself as much as he should, maybe a little too much stress. And I looked at what I was doing. The peak wealth planning was starting to take off. We were getting more ESOP and other clients transitioning to retirement, doing wealth management. And I decided to leave my higher ed treasury job after 20 years and focus 100% on helping families transition to retirement, manage their ESOP wealth, transition that into income, and then all the other pieces of planning that we can talk a little bit about today that go into that.
That makes a lot of sense. So you came about this almost holistically, where just all of your experiences pointed you into this direction, and suddenly the pieces made sense. Your investment experience, and we could, and we won't, but we could do a whole podcast on what it takes to do the collegial investing or the, that sort of thing. But your experience, I wasn't aware of running and helping to run an employee-owned company, certainly framed your view. And ultimately, Peter, and we'll get into the topics, but ultimately, your expertise is applicable, generally speaking, to anybody in the age groups that you would set, 50 or 60. You choose to focus it on the employee ownership space because I imagine a couple of reasons. As we've said, there aren't a whole lot of people doing this. And I've been doing the podcast 7 years. This is my first topic explicitly on this issue. This may be the only topic I can think of that I haven't covered several times before. But the other thing is that unlike a lot of folks who may inherit wealth or come about wealth in different ways, a lot of the folks that you can help are not necessarily high earners in their career, but rather the ESOP distributions when they leave the company may be significantly higher than their wages. So the money is also kind of new to them. And I imagine that takes a certain specialty.
So that's a really good point, Bret. It's one thing, the reason I focus on ESOPs is I really am a passionate believer in this plugging the gap of wealth inequality that we have here in our country. The second piece, you hit upon it. One of my very first clients back in 2015 was a woman that had worked at Amstead, which is a global rail car manufacturing company, had worked at Amstead for 30 plus years. When she left Amstead, she was making maybe $80,000 a year. She was in the corporate office in Chicago, but her ESOP wealth was north of $3.5 million. She also was a very disciplined, what I call super saver, saved regularly in her 401k, was very forward thinking, managed her household budget well. But this ESOP balance plus her 401k balance, when I met her, I think she had about $6 million in assets. So when she transitioned into retirement, which we did over a couple of year period, kind of planning how we're going to do taxes down the road, how we're going to get estate plan done, and then really figuring out what's her retirement budget, what are her desires, right? Does she want to buy a second home? Does she want to fund grandkids' college? Does she want to set up trust for her adult children? And really kind of thinking through those things, but doing all that planning, I find it personally, because I'm just a curious person, I find it very fascinating to learn about the ESOP, the distribution rules, how the taxes work. So that part was intriguing to me. But then this whole idea that she could wind up with a retirement income of 2 to 3 times what she was making when she left her job, and then really coaching that individual. And this is true of any individual that has such a huge uplift later in life in income, is there's really a mental framework shift you have to make about, oh, I have a lot more income available to me, and sort of granting yourself permission with some gratitude and some grace to be able to spend that money and enjoy your life, or help your friends and family enjoy their lives, or maybe it's a charity or your church. So I think there's a little bit of a mindset shift that has to take place as well. And then the other part you hit upon, my background, it was very fascinating when I was doing institutional investment management. When I did this Chartered Financial Analyst program, I was really focused on how do we manage money for the endowment, how do we manage operating cash. But there was a capstone piece of the CFA program, which is like a 3-year graduate degree in finance that I did around age 40. And I found that the wealth management aspect of that capstone program, really resonated with me. It was kind of like reinforcing all the financial planning study I had done, having grown up with my family to sort of better my knowledge about financial planning. So those two things came together. And a few years later, when I had the opportunity to start peak wealth planning and start with a couple of ESOP clients, that sort of just gelled. It like kind of all came together. naturally in terms of like, oh, you could actually do this. You know enough about the institutional side, and you can translate it to the individual side. Investments are investments. You just have to consider the tax situations, and then you bring in all the psychological and planning components of it.
That makes sense. And something that you said resonated with me because, and this may lead us, Peter, to your first topic, which is not just where do you begin, but when do you begin? A lot of folks may have an idea, and something that hit my ear, you had mentioned, perhaps providing for children or grandchildren's education's needs and having a trust like that. And I was very fortunate. My former in-laws were very successful and made educational provisions for their grandchildren. So I have some knowledge of that. So it's one thing if somebody is close to retirement saying, hey, I've got this money coming, it's going to be available, and I know I want to help out my grandkids, and you're able to say, this is the best way to do it. And again, we're just using this as one example. But it's another thing, and this is the power of what struck me of what you were saying, is to get somebody younger in their 50s, a few years away from retirement, and almost dream with you, what does the post-work life look like? How do you plan for it? How can you make provisions for it and know in your 50s that you'll be able to afford it, generally speaking, based on how the ESOP performs, and there are always variables, but the power of, boy, you've never traveled, maybe you have the ability to travel. You've never done this, that, or the other thing, and then layer in all the, you presumably doing it in the most tax advantageous ways. But you are talking about letting people plan out. Now, I'm 60, so I'm a little sensitive to this. I don't want to say their final days, because hopefully it'll last decades, but the final phase of their life, which is post-employment, you can really play a lot of role with starting people well prior to the retirement.
Yes. And just backing up for 1 minute too, because we may have a few listeners in their 30s and 40s. So I do want to put a little tip for them before we go to our 50s and 60s, which is who I really focus on. If you're in your 30s or 40s and you're hearing Bret and I speak today, the most important thing you can do is be a super saver when you get those second or third raises in your career, and dedicate a big part of that raise to that sweet spot decade of about 10 years of savings between 35 and 45 or 40 and 50, when you've got extra income, as much as you can sock away in that 10-year period and invest aggressively in stocks, that can really move the needle on your nest egg instead of waiting till later in your life. And maybe you're listening to this and you don't have an ESOP, so that's even doubly important if you're not an ESOP company.
Let me just also add in, while we're addressing the younger folks here, smarter people than I have been on the podcast, and on my friend Jesse Tyler hosts the Owner to Owner podcast, which I produce, which is Jesse, who's an employee owner at Hypertherm, talking to rank and file employee owners. And one of the common messages that Jesse and a lot of his guests say is also, don't rely just on the ESOP, but max out your 401k, max out other opportunities. And I imagine that's part of the super saver mentality that you're referring to?
Absolutely. Most ESOPs are really well-run companies. There have been some unfortunate failures of ESOPs. Silicon Valley Bank, that was in the news earlier this year, had an ESOP component to their savings plan, and the folks that worked there that had shares lost all their value. So it's not common that there's ESOP failures, but it can happen. We've seen it in other public companies, Enron, to name one, Blockbuster, which, obviously many of us know Blockbuster. So there can be failures. So I always advise folks, no matter where they are, to also save in your 401k or on your own an individual retirement account, or consider the other member of your household, if there is one, that they're saving. So even if your ESOP's doing really well, it's not always the best idea to rely 100% on it. But that being said, I've seen through my 10 years, actually January 1st, of working with ESOP participants at Peak Wealth Planning is our 10-year anniversary. But I've seen some pretty large ESOP balances ranging from $1 million to someone that was a management team that also got options that had $25 million. So I've seen the whole gambit. And that leads into your question, which is, when you have that kind of money relative to your income, what are the discussions you have with your family, maybe with your closest friends, confidants, because not everyone wants to know, you don't want everyone to know you've got significant wealth, but what type of vision do you have? So I have one client in the last couple of years gifted a house to basically her sister that she grew up with, who was a half sister. This woman had done amazing things for her, helping her with her kids and her family for many years. That enabled her to have this career and wind up with a very, very huge ESOP balance. And so it was really important to her to do this gifting to someone important in her life. And then the other thing is, do you want a second career? Do you want a second transition? So that woman and her spouse decided when they left their working regular job and got their ESOPs payouts, they were going to experiment or dabble in being real estate investors. And that is an interesting journey that they're going along right now. And they're finding that maybe there's a little bit more headaches in running Airbnbs than they had originally imagined. Part of my job as an advisor is to coach, and I caution them to slow their roll a little bit and not acquire too many properties too soon. They partly listen to that advice. And I also encourage them, once they ran into some problems, because I used to dabble in real estate myself, that generally anytime you buy a piece of property and it's an investment property and you're involved in it some way, it doesn't usually really make money or look good until about 5 years into it. So you can't get too discouraged too early on. In addition to these topics, the other questions I'm often asked, some are just a little bit more straightforward, which is, at what time can I retire? What's my timeline? Can I retire at 60? Can I retire at 65? Can I retire at 67? So when's a good time to retire? Related to that, questions come up. Well, if I want to retire at 60, that's before Medicare. So for example, how much might it cost me to buy private health insurance for 5 years? And how do I plan with that before Medicare age? The other piece is, we were talking about some people with larger ESOP balances. I've worked with folks with more modest ESOP balances. So the question they'll have is, I was making $80,000 a year and I'm retiring. Can I afford to pay myself from all my accumulated accounts $80,000 a year? And by the way, Peter, help me think through, will my expenses change in retirement? I mentioned the gap if you retire before Medicare age. We also see folks that say, well, maybe they've been paying down their mortgage and their $1,100 a month or their $2,500 a month or their $4,000 a month mortgage is paid off at 63 or 65. And then all of a sudden they've got a bunch of extra room in their budget they weren't aware of. Now, the great thing is they've got extra room in their budget, but what we often see, we have the go-go years when people first retire. Spending often spikes up when people first retire, which is great. They enjoy themselves. Lots of travel usually, not always, but maybe lots of travel or a new hobby. So sometimes we'll see an uptick in expenses. We've also seen, and I'm sure you've heard of this, the sandwich generation, right? We'll have folks that maybe they had kids a little bit later in life. They've got kids that are high schoolers or junior high, maybe going into college, even though this individual, my client's retiring. Maybe their parents are needing some help with long-term care, or someone coming in the house to help them out. Maybe the parents didn't save real well. So the person who's 60 is actually on the hook to help the parents as well as their children. So sometimes you have some really positives in your budget when you're transitioning to retirement, but sometimes you have some unexpected expenses that we quite frankly just didn't plan for. And that's not a good or a bad thing. It just happens sometimes, right? You plan as best as you can for things, and then you make the best of the situation you have.
I imagine part of the power is being in a situation where the unexpected arises and you at least know that you have the wherewithal to handle it oftentimes. That if you have this, that it stinks. And I'm focused, I might have mentioned earlier, I turned 60 this summer. So I am focused on, I sprained my ankle in June and spent the summer on crutches. And, there's a little bit of, and basically my health is fine. So I don't want to turn this around, but it's like, boy, could this fall take out a hip? Could it do whatever? Or are there family emergencies or any of the things that you had alluded to that at least you have that comfort of knowing that you have assets and you have the ability to handle whatever life might throw at you, hopefully.
And that's a really good point, Bret. So one of the families I work with, they have 3 adult children. The gentleman did very well with his ESOP, huge ESOP balance when he left ESOP company in Chicago, about $6 million in the ESOP, and actually a very small 401k balance, $300,000 401k balance. So all of his wealth for the most part was in the ESOP. And today that's like $10 million because it's grown and it's in an IRA. But he and his wife have made it a real priority. They have 3 adult children that have careers and they're doing relatively well in their careers given their ages, but they've also had some challenges where, one was going to work in a particular industry, graphic design, and they couldn't stay in that industry. So they shifted to another career and they had to live in an expensive area to move to this hospital job. So I have seen some families have capacity because of the ESOP to say, we can help support our adult children to some degree relative to their comfort level and add their enhancements to their lives that without the ESOP, quite honestly, would not have been possible at all. In fact, that family, I was working with them and their estate planning attorney over the last 3 months, where we're setting up estate documents. And we've actually been talking about, is there a gifting strategy we need to do to gift some additional funds each year to the adult children that they might not spend right away, but they put in a savings account or an investment account, because we don't want the parents to have too much money when they pass away, because Illinois has an estate tax. So we're trying to manage the parents having enough money for the next 30 to 40 years of their lives, assuming they live to 100. But then how do we make sure that the tax bill when they pass away is not too high? So we don't just plan for what's happening tomorrow, next year, or 5 years. Again, we're not going to get it perfect, but we're going to do our level best to plan out what's going to happen in 20 or 25 years. And we have software and we model that. We have a lot of conversations. And my job is really to be the quarterback between the estate planning attorney, the family and what they desire, as well as their CPA. So literally yesterday I was on the phone with the family and the estate attorney. And then yesterday afternoon, evening, I was on the phone with the CPA. And then this morning, we're closing it all by email and saying, here's our plan for the next 5 years. So there's a lot of pieces that come together, especially if clients or families have significant wealth. So it really varies, who we work with and what's going on, but it's really important to hit upon those different pieces and do that holistic 360 financial plan.
It also was a reminder to me that I run into all kinds of people, and I used to practice law prior to becoming an ESOP trustee. And, you'd hear, hey, my CPA gave me financial planning advice, or my estate lawyer talked about this investment and that kind of thing. And I just want to differentiate. They might have seen and experienced any number of things in their careers and may well be competent, but you want to talk for the financial planning to be with somebody like yourself, not somebody who does it as and I guess I'm speaking definitively when it should be a question, but not somebody who is a CPA and runs an accounting practice and also gives a little bit of investment advice. You really want that expertise at these higher levels to make sure that you're getting the most up-to-date sound advice. Is that correct?
I think that's a fair statement, Bret. I am a fiduciary, so I have a fiduciary responsibility to act in the best interest of the families I work with and do the research for them on a particular topic. That being said, if there's something I don't understand or I want to double check on, I'll pick up the phone and call the CPA, or I'll pick up the phone and call the estate attorney. My expertise is the investments, how much money is in the account, how much you can spend. I will say that definitely come from a higher ed background, PhD, CFA, had a lot of education. I'm constantly learning. I went a couple of years ago and took the Chicago estate planning course for 6 weeks, not because I was going to become an estate planner, but I wanted to ask better questions of the estate planning attorneys I work with to do a better job for my families. But I've worked with some estate planning attorneys the last couple of years that have taught me so much about irrevocable trust and taxation. And so I feel like there's a back and forth, but at the end of the day, it's my fiduciary responsibility to say, this is how you should invest the money that's in your IRA, that's in your 401k, that's in your ESOP. This is when you should take Social Security. I give that fiduciary advice, and ultimately it's up to the client to say, yeah, I accept that fiduciary advice, or they may want to check with their CPA, and I'm happy for them to do this. Double check with your accountant, make sure the advice I gave you on the timing of the taxes is congruent with your accountant says, because I don't follow your tax return, but I want to see it every year so I know what's going on.
Peter, let's do a little bit of housekeeping and then we'll get back in here, because you've referenced Chicago, you've referenced Illinois a little bit, and I just want to talk about your service footprint for just a moment. And that is, I know that you personally have offices in Illinois and in Colorado. Does your firm have other offices as well? And despite the location of your offices, is your reach national, where the tax laws may change from state to state?
Excellent question. My reach is national. Right now, we have clients in Florida, Wisconsin, Chicago, and Colorado, but we can work with clients in any state. Some of my clients have homes in multiple states, even though those are their states they reside in. We can work nationally. That being said, my practice, we're very selective. Right now, we work with 24 families. In the next 5 years, we'll probably take on 16 more families, give or take. So, 1 to 3 families a year. We tend to work with higher net worth families, net worth of $2 million or above. That part of the reason I do a lot of conference education, our newsletter, speaking engagements, podcasts like this is we can't serve everyone. We specialize in folks with more complex challenges, but it takes a lot more time to spend all that effort with their CPAs and their estate attorneys, which is why we serve a smaller group of clients. So we really try to niche down and serve that space very well. I do have some clients outside of the ESOP space that are either real estate investors, real estate developers, private equity folks, or just super high income earners. But for the growth for the next 3 to 5 years for the firm, I think the ESOP space is where we're going to concentrate. And by the way, even though we're talking about ESOPs and many of them are private companies, we have done some work with families that have public company stock. And some of the principles of diversifying public company stock are very similar to ESOP stock. And there's even some unique things you can do with public company stock in terms of deferring taxes, but continuing to invest in the US equity markets across time. So we've done some specialty work in that area as well.
And one of the cool things, and this is with my ESOP hat squarely on, is when you talk about, 2 million as a rough floor, et cetera, we see that in the ESOP space. Now, candidly, it happens one of 2 times, or one of 2 occasions primarily. One is the company is sold and all of the employees get disbursements, and that can get lucrative for the employees. New Belgium Brewing comes to mind. Fat Tire was based in Colorado. Great employee-owned company, sold out to a Japanese conglomerate. We miss them as employee owners. They were great in our space, but 192 employees got $1 million plus checks as part of the sale to the conglomerate. So that happens with some regularity. And then the other way, of course, is, and we're not specifically focused on the 20 or 30 years olds with this conversation, but if you start working for an employee-owned company in your 20s and 30s and are with them through retirement, a 30 or 40-year career, which we see with some regularity, those balances can be extremely robust as well.
Absolutely. When we do conference presentations, I will often work with HR person or the controller from a ESOP company, because we're financial planners and we're talking about retirement. In many cases, the question we're also asked a lot is, what about ESOP for wealth building? What does it mean for me if I've been at the company for 8 or 15 years and I'm not thinking about retirement yet? So we will work with those companies and say, give a snapshot of average ESOP and 401k balance for cohorts of employees at age 35, at age 45, and we'll build some stories and vignettes based on actual data. So the ESOP, when we're talking about it at a conference, is real, and the wealth building aspect is real for that individual who's 45 years old. Why might that be important, Bret? Well, maybe they have a lifelong dream of starting a business and their ESOP has done really well, and they've been at that company from 28 to 45 years old. They have 17 years on the ESOP, and all of a sudden they have a $800,000 ESOP balance. Their company might pay them out, over 4 years if they leave at 45. Yeah, they'll have some tax penalties and a little bit of the tax hickey, but that may give them the ability to start a business that they never would have been able to start but for the ESOP. So I think it's important, even though my practice was a lot focused on people, heading into retirement. I think it's important to look at those long-term participants younger and say, what does the ESOP mean for wealth building too? And when I go to conferences, I will often hear from HR folks and CFOs, like, we want to make the ESOP more salient for our employees. And how do we do that, Peter? So like putting together these stories and these vignettes and sharing them as one way to do that. I guess I should mention, you had asked me before and I just forgot to mention it. One of the services we did in 2022 and we're starting to roll out in 2024 is we will go into ESOP companies and design custom training for those mid-career folks and those near retirement folks. And we do that for a fee, but we really understand the ESOP plan and we put together the stories, and we'll come in do the training to make it more real for the retention, or do specific education around their ESOP, their distribution diversification rules for a specific company's plan. But it takes a while to get up to speed on the plan, because what I've learned, and you used to be a trustee, so I'm sure you know this, you've seen one ESOP, you've seen an ESOP. They're not all the same. And I naively thought early on, well, a lot of these are really similar. When you start going into like, well, not really. We freeze your account, and the other one, your account value moves with the stock. So there's a lot of nuances to ESOPs, and that's where even the planning side for me as a planner, I have to get the plan document, read it, make sure I understand it before I can give any advice.
And Peter, let me just give a heads up, a spoiler alert, if you will. What you just spoke about with company provided education is going to be the topic of another podcast that we'll be recording after this one, very broadly working with the companies from that perspective and the importance of it. But you were also, your second point is oh so critical. There are generalities that we tend to talk about almost by shorthand in ESOP and ESOP plans. And the challenge is if you don't fit into the generalities, it's wrong information. But, so we'll often talk, normally we would expect a plan to see retirement at 65 or 62. It can be whatever the company sets. Payoffs, I often see a 5-year window before payoffs begin, all things being equal. You had referenced 4 years. And then disability or death come into play and how that affects the plan. So very broadly speaking, people want to familiarize themselves with their specific plan. And a lot of the information that we cover is covered in the SPD, the summary plan description that every ESOP employee is required to get. And certainly your trustee or whoever, perhaps HR handles the ESOP information, can provide the SPD, the summary plan description. But those are the details. You're speaking in broad strokes where the final details may change.
The summary plan document is what I usually first request from a company. If I'm working with them or an individual participant, I want to read that SPD. And then if I have questions or things are not 100% clear, I'll say to my client, hey, let's jump on the phone with your HR representative and answer these nuanced questions about the summary plan document. So I think that one of the benefits we've had is we've had a couple of clients where we have multiple clients from the same ESOP. So then we get to understand that particular ESOP, and then it's a little bit easier for us to give advice for the second and third client from that company instead of the first one that we work through. I do want to bring this back around to more specific retirement planning. We've talked a lot about the ESOP. One of our planning pieces we bring together is, will my accumulated nest egg be enough to support my goals? And when I think about nest egg, we've talked a lot about our one, working ESOP participant, but a lot of times these folks are in a household. And I view the nest egg as a litany of accounts. What's in a savings? What's in my individual retirement account? Money I've saved on my own or my spouse or partner saved on their own? What's in the 401k of myself, my spouse or partner? Do I have a health savings account plus the ESOP, which is in many cases of the clients I work with, the lion's share of their wealth? When does Social Security kick in? Because that's a steady income stream. Do I have a pension? Often I don't if I'm an ESOP company that I've seen, but maybe your spouse is a school teacher and they have a pension. And have you inherited some money? Or maybe you hustle on the weekends and fix up real estate because you love working with your hands. So I think that it's important also to zoom out when we're doing retirement planning and look at all these different pieces. And one thing to point out is each one of those accounts or types of investments might have different tax treatment. So it's important when you're working with a financial planner or doing it on your own is to try to understand how your taxes may change when you enter retirement. So just keep that in mind if you're looking to hire a financial planner or you're doing your own financial planner. And then the other piece I wanted to mention is I just listed 6 or 7 different accounts. But if you had to do very, very broad strokes, so this is like literally cocktail napkin, not guaranteed, big disclaimer. But if someone just comes to me off the street and says, hey, Peter, I have $3 million. Can I retire? What can I spend? I said, I don't know anything about your spending habits. I don't know anything about your tax situation, but you just want a gross rule of thumb. It's roughly 4% at $3 million. And that's about $120,000 a year. Now, is that before or after tax? I have no idea. I don't know what your accounts are. But if you want a rule of thumb, 4%. If you want to be super conservative, let's call the rule of thumb 3%. You got $3 million, you can spend $90,000 a year. So You might want to be more conservative if you have a lot of unknowns or unexpecteds coming up. If you're, really solid and you've also got a pension or Social Security, then maybe that 4% is fine. Maybe you can even go a little higher, 4.5%. It really just depends on your unique situation. But I like to paint the picture so people at least have an idea. And by the way, if you're 30 years old or 35 years old and you're listening to this, think about that in terms of blocks, right? You've got your ESOP block, your IRA block. If your ESOP's $500,000 and your IRA is $500,000 or your 401k is $500,000, so half and half, generally each account's going to generate half of your retirement income. So just to give a little bit of an insight into retirement income forecasting at a very high level, that's how those blocks fit together. And then the other piece I think is important to point out is, if you're 55 and you're listening to this podcast, here's just a list of things you might want to think about prior to retirement. You may want to check in on that income forecast I just mentioned and say, I'm 50, am I saving enough? Am I going to hit my goal? If not, if I'm not saving enough, do I need to take a hard look at my budget? Never any fun. None of us like looking at our budget, but you may need to take a look at the budget. If you're approaching retirement, Carmen, my marketing director, likes to say, have you paid off all your consumer debt? Do you have any credit card bills? Do you have a retail store card? Maybe you have millions in an ESOP, but you love shopping at Kohl's and you have a big Kohl's balance. Well, do you want to pay that off before you retire, right? Sometimes we have really good things happening in our financial lives over here, but maybe not the best financial things happening over here. So looking holistically, so do I have any consumer debt I can pay off? And we see consumer debt, retail, automobile, a little bit different than a mortgage, right? Most of us need a place to live. That's the other piece. Is my mortgage going to be paid off around the time I retire, or am I going to buy a second home? So two balancing acts of housing. Have my adult children fully launched? Earlier in the podcast, I mentioned people that help their adult children. Some other parents like, I'm done, you're out, you're on your own, right? So it really depends on that. And then the other piece is taxes. If I'm 60 and I stop working and I don't have to take any distributions till I'm 75, can I do some Roth conversions, save on my taxes across my lifetime? And then we've mentioned the ESOP, concentrated stock, builds a lot of wealth. Do you need to diversify your stock and change your investment mix? Diversification often preserves wealth. And then the most important thing, I think, if you're nearing retirement and you haven't actually retired, is to really think about, there's a lot of articles have been in the Wall Street Journal in the last year about this, is how are you going to spend your time if you were at your job for 35, 40, 45, 50 hours a week? That's probably the most important one. The financial piece we can work out on paper, but what are you going to do socially? Are you going to take up new hobbies? We don't want folks depressed or unhappy in retirement or shortening their lifespan because they don't have a purpose. What's the Japanese word? Ikigai. So I think it's really important also to do some self-reflection. This may not be my specialty. I'm happy to talk with clients about it, but really look at how does your life picture look when you transition? And that opens up a whole nother set of options for people depending on those choices.
I love that, Peter, because you started the podcast with references to how do you proceed with grace and gratitude. And you've just now talked about creating a meaningful existence a little bit. And certainly it takes some financial capital to do that, although you can live a very meaningful life with grace and gratitude, without significant dollars. There are plenty of people who aren't rich who find meaning in their life. But I love the fact that the conversations aren't just what's the balance, but what you're really saying is how are we going to map out the next phase of your life? And that's just a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, it's really fun to help people along that journey. I have an ESOP client right now who's approaching age 60, and she's thinking she's going to be at her company having been 25 years this spring. We're talking for her is she might shift out of what she does to managing a gym because she's super into physical fitness and super into body improvement and helping others. So she's thinking about a second act, and potentially having her ESOP balance plus what she saved in her 401k will allow her to leave, take a different job that challenges her differently for 5, 7, 10, 15 years, and still let her ESOP move to an IRA, build up wealth while she's still working until she hits at least Medicare and Social Security age, and maybe even longer if she enjoys that, let's call it second act. So I think it's important to recognize that there's many things we can do. And to recognize too, Brett, and you hit the nail on the head. We've talked about some large ESOP balances in the podcast today. I do want to make it 100% clear that there is no problem. People can retire with Social Security and $500,000 in a 401k and $100,000 or $200,000 in an IRA and have a very meaningful retirement. It just means you might make different choices in how you spend your time, or you might travel a little bit less. But there's lots of things, and as you know, hundreds, if not thousands, of communities around the U.S. where you can retire well and meaningfully contribute to your church or your community or your family without having the kind of dollars we're talking about. I think it's important to recognize that as well.
And similarly, Peter, obviously our mutual goal for the podcast is that you attract some of the right individuals to your practice, but there are plenty of folks in the space. Just because you don't focus on $500,000 or $600,000 net worth, there are plenty of folks in your space who will work with people like that as well. So the advice that you're giving is spot on. You won't necessarily, it doesn't fit your business model to take, clients in the quote unquote lower range.
Right.
It's funny, $500,000 isn't what it used to be. But at the same time, there is certainly competent professional advice that people can get.
Yeah. And then folks can, you can call Vanguard and talk to Vanguard. They have a financial planning division now. So if you're in that range, that would be one place you could talk to. That's not an endorsement or a recommendation. They're just a low-cost mutual fund provider. So that's one option, but there's many other options out there. You can talk to Fidelity. You can do a search for CFP, Certified Financial Planner near me, and look for someone with the CFP designation. So there's lots of options too, for sure.
Peter, I want to thank you for your time and expertise. There's a whole other range of topic that we didn't get to today that we're going to add in a new episode, and that's going to be the mechanics of diversification and some of the things that you should look at as you're approaching retirement age. And we'll include that as a second episode from you. And again, as we mentioned earlier in this episode, we're also planning to have a third episode that is what companies can do for financial literacy, if I'm using that word correctly, on the home front. And what I love about that topic is that employee-owned companies spend so much time, the vast majority of them, on some level of open book management, on some level of sharing the financials, that it's very natural extension in my mind to say, hey, we're going to have a program that will teach you how to do this at home as well. And when you talked earlier very briefly, and this will be a whole episode, but what's your life going to look like 10 or 20 or 25 years after you retire? Well, companies are doing that very generally with long-range planning as well. So we're going to do an episode where you're just going to use some of those tools and bring it to the individual. So we've got 2 more episodes coming up. Peter, thank you so much for your time today. This was just a great conversation and very informative.
Thank you, Brett. I enjoyed it very much. And as a parting wisdom for your listeners today, I think it's just really important to be retirement ready wherever you are in your journey. Forecast your retirement income and budget, and consider doing this on your own or hiring a planner, but try to do and cover the range of topics we've talked about for yourself, because it's really important to look at these things and try to avoid surprises and have less stress when you coast into your retirement years.
That is a perfect way to sum it up. My thanks to my guest, Peter Newman of Peak Wealth Planning. You can find his contact information in the show notes for this episode. Again, he puts out a very informative email newsletter that I have subscribed to forever, it seems like, and I recommend that you do that as well. And I certainly hope that you will check out the couple of future episodes that we're going to have with Peter in short order on distribution and technical aspects of retirement, and then on company education. So my appreciation, my thanks again to Peter Newman. My thanks to Carmen, his marketing director, who kind of helped facilitate everything. I'm always grateful for the marketing folks who bring me guests. And especially I'm grateful, as always, to you, the listener. With that, we'll wrap it up. My name is Bret Keisling. Thank you so much. Be well.
We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Facebook at EO Podcast Network and on Twitter at ESOP Podcast. This podcast has been produced by Bret Keisling for the EO Podcast Network. Original music composed by Max Keisling. Branding and marketing by Bitsy Plus Design. And I'm Bitsy McCann.